Welcome, everyone. In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into a really powerful story from the Quran. It's a story that feels ancient, but you'll see it's about something we all deal with, a sacred boundary, and what happens when we decide to cross it. Just think about that for a second. You know that quiet voice inside, that gut feeling that says, hey, don't do this, but you go ahead and do it anyway? It's such a universal human feeling, right? That moment we transgress against what we know deep down is right for us. Well, it turns out there's an ancient story in the Quran that speaks directly to that exact moment. It's the story of the people of Thamud. And what's so wild is that they weren't destroyed because they were unintelligent or unsophisticated. Nope. They were destroyed because they broke a boundary that was actually put there for their own good. Okay, so let's start with the outer story, the one we read on the surface. We're going to look at the historical narrative of the people of Thamud and their prophet, Saleh. The Quran actually points to three really specific things that led to their downfall. First up was rejection. They just couldn't accept guidance from Prophet Saleh because, in their eyes, he was just one of them. It was pure arrogance. That pride then led to the second step, the arrival of a sacred sign, which was a she-camel. And then the final fatal move, the violation of that sign. And you know what's so interesting? The test itself. It wasn't some huge, complicated theological exam. It was actually a simple, everyday test of their character. This she-camel, called the Naqat Allah, or the she-camel of God, required them to share the town's water source. One day for the people, one day for the camel. That's it. It was just a test of fairness, of discipline, and whether they could live alongside something sacred. And this verse, wow, it just captures that moment of transgression so perfectly. It says they called their companion. Think about that. It implies this was a group decision, a collective act of defiance. Even if only one person actually did the deed, the whole community was in on it. They were all complicit in violating a sacred limit they knew they shouldn't cross. And the consequence? It was just as quick and total. It wasn't a long war. It was a single, terrifying blast that turned their whole civilization into what the Quran beautifully and terrifyingly calls dried stalks. It's such a powerful metaphor for how crossing sacred lines doesn't just chip away at you, it can lead to a sudden, complete collapse. All right, now let's peel back a layer and get to the inner meaning, because this is where the story really starts to speak to us today. For centuries, Sufi commentators have seen this whole narrative as more than just history. They see it as a perfect map of our own inner world. This comparison here, this is the whole game changer. The people of Thamud, that's our own ego, our nafs, that part of us that just fights humility and simple guidance. And the she-camel, well, she's not just an animal. She's a symbol for our conscience, that sacred trust or emana that's placed inside each of us. The water they had to share, that's the balance we have to find between all our different impulses. And the slaughter of the camel, that's the ultimate act of self-betrayal, when we knowingly, deliberately silence our own conscience. The great mystic Najm al-Din Kobra put it so beautifully. He says the she-camel is the trust of the heart. So when we harm it, when we ignore that inner voice, we're not breaking some external rule. We're actually violating our own sacred inner space. And that single blast that destroyed them, mystics say, that's not just some ancient historical event. That's what happens inside us after we've ignored our inner voice for too long. You know? You can spend years deceiving yourself, pushing past your own limits, and then one single moment of truth can make the whole thing just collapse. And what's absolutely wild is how this ancient spiritual insight lines up perfectly with what modern psychology tells us about ourselves and our well-being. It doesn't matter what words you use, psychology, ethics, spirituality, the truth is the same. Psychologists will tell you that constantly violating your personal boundaries leads straight to burnout and feeling broken inside. Ethicists know that pride is almost always the engine that lets people steamroll their own conscience. And anyone who works with trauma knows that when you keep suppressing your inner warning signals, you're building up an internal pressure that will eventually lead to a break. So all of this brings the story right here, to us. After telling these stories, the Quran often asks, so, is there anyone who will remember? That's not a history pop quiz. That's a question for our own hearts, right now. So let's really ask ourselves, what is my inner she-camel? What's that sacred trust, that core value, that deep responsibility I carry that I just know I must not harm? And where has my own pride made me just dismiss the simple, quiet guidance that comes my way? Just like the people of Thamud dismissed Prophet Saleh because he was just a human, where do we dismiss the wisdom of our own conscience because it seems too simple or too ordinary? And let's get really practical with this last one. Where am I, right now, violating my own limits, emotionally, spiritually, ethically? Where am I crossing a line, even though I know better? I think if there's one big takeaway from this whole story, it's this shift in how we see boundaries. They're not meant to be restrictions or cages. They are sacred safeguards. They're there to protect the very core of who we are. Honoring them isn't about limitation. It's the highest form of self-respect and spiritual wholeness. Let's just end with this simple prayer. O Allah, protect the trust you placed in me. Do not let pride make me harm what is sacred. Give me wisdom to honor my limits and humility to hear your guidance even when it comes in simple, human form. Ameen.